Thank you for joining us for the next panel session here in the Glass Room. This session is called Business Basics, Growing Your Game Studio. So some insightful guidance, hopefully, from these three individuals that we'll come to in a second. Do you mind shutting the door so we can make the noise a little bit quieter? Is that John? Thank you, John, for doing that. John Stopworth, he was a legend earlier. He's still a legend now. Sorry. And just to remind you, there's a couple of other panels taking place, 2 more panels in this room afterwards. So there's the agenda there. If you want to stay on or come back for those, please do so. All right, let me move on to the fancy screen and come and take a seat and join you. How are we all doing? All right?
Very well, thank you. Yes, good, thank you.
Are you enjoying the festival?
Very much so.
Right, getting to my questions. While I find my questions, the first thing is for you to introduce yourselves, actually. So I'm going to start with you, Neil. Tell us who you are. What do we need to know about you?
Crikey, where do I start? So, hi, I'm Neil Parmar from Escape Technology. I've been involved with the games development industry for over 30 years, and been there with the early days of who are the AAAs today. But my background's technical, and we're now part of a company now which is very much a tech-based company that's pretty much made up of individuals from industry. So we can actually talk about art, we can talk about workflows and all that kind of stuff. We essentially are a reseller for a lot of the products you see out there, a lot of the art tools, etc. But you can actually have a conversation with us and we can actually give you some really good guidance.
Amazing, thank you. Phil?
Yeah, hey everybody, nice to meet you. My name's Phil. I started a company called GG Insurance about 6 and a bit years ago. So my background is in insurance. I've always been a huge gamer, and I've managed to find a way to kind of combine my job with something I'm really interested in, which is great. But now we've got a few hundred games companies that we insure around the world, and we get to see all kinds of gory details when stuff goes wrong. So we've got a kind of unique perspective on the industry. So yeah, slightly different angle, but
when things go wrong,
yeah.
No. Are we going to hear any of those war stories?
I can sanitize them without naming names a little bit.
We don't want any horror stories. But I suppose being aware of these things is important, so we'll come on to that, no doubt. And Gareth, hello, how are you? You all good?
Very well, thank you.
Yeah, right. Who are you? What do we need to know?
So, I'm Gareth. I'm a director at BDO, which is a professional services company. So we assist games companies all over the place with things like video games tax relief, getting ready for sale, working through the sales process, having horrible people look at all your books and records in due diligence, and everything in between. So we're very much a support business that helps game studios of all sorts of shapes and sizes.
So we'll work on the assumption, looking around at our audience and the general profile of the festival here, that there are people that are looking to get into the industry, people that are running small studios, thinking about setting up a studio. There's quite a lot of that going on at the moment, or they're already working in the industry and looking to grow and enhance and develop. So we're going to try and cover as much of that as possible, but you all do it from a different angle with a different area of expertise, working in a different sector. So we'll go through you all first, just to look at the sort of work that you do. When we'll start in the startup phase in day one. So Gareth, just to start to you. So what are the absolute basics, the sort of page one stuff that studios need to think about starting up, getting their business up and running? The real fundamentals. What are the key things from BDO's perspective?
Yeah, so the big starting point is, because you are transitioning into this being a business, not any longer a thing you do with your mates or a hobby or whatever it might have been prior to that, you need to think about your structure. So you might want a company, you might not. But early days, you need to think about those things because they're going to matter in the future. And I know we'll talk about the future later in the session. So the absolute fundamentals there are finding people who can help you with that, because it's going to be alien to you. I think the key things you should do in your early days are start to build your support network. And from my perspective, that is people in professional services. So you would be looking at lawyers, because they can help with lots of things. Accountants, they can help with lots of things. Business advisors, banks, financiers, all of those sorts of things all have great exposure to the industry and specialisms if you find the right people, and you just start to build those networks. Events like this are great because you get to meet them. Yuki obviously has great connections in with all sorts of different people. That's another way of getting to meet them. But for me, when you're starting out, that's what I want to see you doing, is building those connections. You may not need them for years, but when you do, they will be valuable.
Okay, I'm going to come on to you next, Phil, but I just want to check, can everyone in the room hear all of the speakers? They've all spoken, we all good? A little louder. All right, so let's move the microphones a little bit closer when we talk. I mean, let's start with that. Good. So Phil, over to you now. So from your particular expertise, studio comes to you, they've just started, they're thinking about setting up, or they've just set up. What are the early considerations from your perspective?
Yeah, I'd pretty much echo those comments where you want to start treating it like a business. It's not just we're making a hobby game anymore. You've got to treat a business like a business, and don't be afraid to ask questions. If there's something you don't know, don't try and figure it out on your own. There's tons of people around that can help you. Reach out to lawyers, accountants, insurance people even, and anyone else that wants to help. Because what I find is a lot of the sort of service providers in this industry, like us guys, genuinely care and we want to help. So if there's something that you don't know, ask us. And another thing that I see is when you're starting out, the actual formation of the company, especially if you're getting involved with other people, is like divvying up ownership and shares and who's doing what and who's responsible for what, because it's all fun and games when you're making a project, but when it's launched and suddenly you find out you're making tons and tons of money, hopefully, that's when arguments start to happen if you didn't set it up right in the first place on, well, who's earning this, who's earning that, and is it all just shared equally or what? That's when arguments happen. So definitely get all that stuff right. Get all your housekeeping done. Assume that you're going to be successful on day one and build for that. That's my thought.
That's interesting philosophy about assuming you're going to be successful. So you're almost projecting into the future and imagining where you're going to be.
Yeah, manifest it.
I will come back to you in a second, Neil, for this one. But do you find studios do that? Are studios bold enough to think, I'm getting the infrastructure in place now for the future?
I think they should. Not all of them do.
But they don't. Okay.
Not all of them do, yeah. But.
Interesting. All right. And Neil, from your perspective, I mean, you've worked with games companies for
a long time.
For a while. Yeah, I just had to word that carefully, and I just went silent.
Yeah, okay. I'm one of the dinosaurs from the industry.
But with that comes great experience.
It does, absolutely. Thanks, mate.
Okay.
No, we've seen studios who have grown from a 2-man crew, 5-man crew, right up to AAAs. The thing I'll say to a lot of these new startups, etc., is firstly, get out there. Get to events like this. Okay? Start showing off who you guys are, what you're made of in terms of what projects you're working on, etc. Start talking to all these people. This is an extension of our family, of the gaming industry. They're not going to say no to you. Guarantee you can go out there and have a conversation with someone who you don't even know. They will talk to you. This is the industry that we're in, and this is the reason why we love the game development industry. That we all want to see success. I've been involved where a 2-man crew, give them a 3 to 5 year plan, and they're focused. But at the same time, I'm saying to them, don't be this great big secret that no one knows about. Get out there and start showing and start flying your flag, because people will start talking about you. And that will help you as a studio grow long term.
It's fascinating, that whole getting out there and shouting about your business and in doing so promoting yourself. It's quite a difficult thing to do though, isn't it?
It is, and often people are quite shy to do this. But the industry that we're in, it is now, it's growing up massively. It's gone are the days where you just hide behind in a little cupboard in the room, etc., and create a game and launch it. Now it's a real business, and we've grown up. As an industry, the whole gaming industry has grown up. I've seen a huge change in the last 15 years. And these huge milestones that now appear, they've got, unfortunately, got a financial figure on it. So we've got to hit those milestones to stay alive. But at the same time, the studios have to get out there. Start talking to these other studios. Hey, you might even do some co-working with these people. This is what it's about. It's the connection.
So we're going to leap forward a little bit. We're going to go back to some of the detail in a second. But you've given us some good guidance for when we're starting out, what we need to do. Get out there, make good friends, talk to anyone, get the basics in place. Let's say that our studio, because this can happen very quickly, our 2-person studio can suddenly have a big hit on their hands. The growth stage, we hit that growth stage. It's a really difficult stage for companies because they need staff, they need funding, they need expertise they don't have. There's all of these things and challenges that come to them. What are the things they need to do in that growth stage then? You kind of hope the basics are there, but we'll start at this end if that's all right and just run through it again. So company comes to you, perhaps they're finding faster growth than they thought, or they're ambitious and they're making waves. What are the considerations from your perspective?
So as we talked about in the startup, where you go from hobby to business, the next stage when these things happen is the real professionalisation of it.
Right.
And that's when you need to start looking at those support services and bringing some of them in-house quite often. Your point is a really good one, which is, you've had some success. That's normally why it's happened. You can't get going quick enough to keep up with the demand almost of what you next need to do for the next level of success. And so what you need to start doing there is, that's when you might have your first internal finance function, because you need that budgeting, you need someone with their hands on it that in the nicest possible way you can stand on their throat and keep an eye on them, which you can't always do with external people. So it's that next step on the ladder, if you like, the next rung up is professionalise. Might mean that you need HR people because your people needs have outgrown what you as an individual can do. In the early stages, it's very hand to mouth, and you have to take on a lot as the entrepreneur yourself. As you scale up, you need to learn to let go of those things, and that's why building those connections early on is brilliant, because then you've got people you go, I already know who I can be talking to. These people might be the ones to offer to bring in. They might be the people who can help me. You'll still need external advisors, and you've got to balance how to use them. But if you've built that network in the early stage, you're then well set to do that next bit.
You're almost suggesting that they take on some of the functions themselves rather than using external people? That seemed to be what you were saying, or is there a mixture of both, do you think, at this growth phase?
It is a mixture of both.
Right.
And there are things that will suit one way and will suit the other. So if you think about some of the largest studios, they will have in-house tax function, in-house purchase ledger, all of these things, in-house payroll. You won't jump straight to that. So you may still outsource your tax work, for example, but you say, actually, I do need someone who's looking after my purchase ledger and my books and records in-house. I need someone who is responsible for that, who I have day-to-day oversight of. That's the kind of thing you start to bring in, and it's different for everyone, the thing you might do. It's always surprising to me how some people survive brilliantly without a CFO for a very long time.
Right.
And it does work, but that's because they've worked out why it works. The critical bit is, again, speaking to the people you can trust and working that bit out.
Yeah. And Phil, on an insurance side, so a company's starting to grow, what are the new considerations for them when growth comes on board?
Yeah, I mean, it depends what you mean by growth and what the company's doing. So there's so many different games companies out there. Are they just working on a game and it's been a hit? That's great. Or are they doing work for hire and they're just getting more and more appointments? And do you mean that by growth? And I guess what's important to them and where we see things go wrong is if they assume that their growth and success is going to last forever, because it doesn't always, and they want to try to build their business model around whatever they're doing is sustainable. So if they're doing work for hire, then great, go and get more appointments and make sure you're delivering on the work that you're doing. But if it's a game that you've made and it's a hit, how can you kind of milk that for as long as possible while you're working on the next one? So yeah, trying to build your business as a sustainable business and not just it's all on one hit and then suddenly the sales drop off and it's like, oh, what do we do now? So yeah, my top tip would be make it sustainable, because yeah, the industry's in a strange place at the moment. So yeah, that's
we're on the downward side of the curve. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, it's been a shame. We've seen a lot of companies that have struggled and they've had issues and with it not being a particularly sustainable market. So trying to build a business model that works.
But isn't that a reason for getting the basics sorted, so that when things do go wrong, you've still got a solid base and you don't have to worry about those things?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, you need a solid foundation that can sort of weather storms. So yeah, don't just assume it's always going to be brilliant.
So how do the conversations change thank you for that. How do the conversations change, Neil, when studio that you've helped get up and running, couple of person studio, suddenly employs 20, 30, 40 people? what are the conversations like with them? What are the different things that you help them with when they get to that stage?
I think we get a phone call saying, this doesn't work anymore. Everything's gone slow on the network. Oh my God, help us.
Do they do it in that voice?
Well, apparently so, yeah. So I think from our standpoint, this is quite normal for us. We'll get a phone call saying, can you come out on site now? We need to have a conversation. What we find is a lot of the startups, the studios, they'll just completely get inundated with a lot of hardware and software and tools, etc., just to get a job out the door or just to kind of get going. What we're saying is get us involved from the early stages. We can start talking to you about the tools, etc., what you're going to need for future growth. We can start talking to you about your infrastructure, etc. Because all this, there's a cost to it. And, any studio starting up doesn't just have an abundance of cash. Okay, if they do, that's fantastic. But often these startups don't really have all that money pit. So I think they need to just reach out to technology partners like us. We're very unique. It's not just a plug, but it's a fact. We're the company itself. We were once upon a time Escape Studios, the people that trained people to get into the VFX world from a commercial angle. So we've been there, done that, and we can, like I said, we will always advise these new startups. In fact, it's always a proud moment for us. What we can say is that we were there from day one to help these studios grow. But part of this growth has got to be the right tool sets and the right infrastructure. Because as you know right now, there's a lot of this hybrid working, etc. Data, how secure is this data? Are you working with a publisher? Does that publisher want your data to leave your building so Fred down the road can do some artwork? Well, often the case is no. And we need to address that because it is quite a serious thing. If there's any data breach whatsoever with a lot of these startups, that's the end of the studio because that's your reputation as well.
Well, that was a bit of doom and gloom at the end of that one. But as I look at my question here, it's another doom and gloom question. I'm really sorry about that. So I'm sure we'll pick it up in a minute, so bear with us, sorry. So this is a question about pitfalls. So ideally so far, we were talking about the great opportunities and growth and what have you. Thanks, Neil. And, the opportunities for growth and investment to build those business basics. But things do go wrong. And I'm assuming, not that I know, but it's the same things that you see time and time again from companies. So let's have a look at some of the pitfalls, because you can learn from some of these mistakes as well. So, Gareth, if you can grab a microphone, I'll start with you, if that's all right. So what are the, I'm going to call them standard pitfalls, but the repetitious pitfalls that you see studios falling into? What are the things they miss?
Yeah, so Phil's mentioned some of the things actually that we see quite regularly, and it is that point of, so shareholder agreements is a great one. People will set up a company and they won't think about actually who's putting what in. They might not have really thought about what each of them wants from the business, because at the early days it's, well, we want to do something brilliant and we've got an idea, and that's terrific for that moment. But actually, as you rightly said, what then happens is you roll down 2 or 3 years and then person X is saying, well, I want to go in this direction. Person Y is going, well, I want to go in that direction. You go, but we're 50-50, we're at loggerheads, and it all gets very messy and it's a waste of effort. If you get those things sorted out at the beginning, you won't have those problems, because firstly, you bring forward all of those challenges of what do people really want out of this and iron them out early, and also you document it. And what that means is that you've all got something that you're working to, and actually that will probably help you in any event because you know what each of you wants. And it could be that 2, 3, 4 years down the line, one of the founders says, actually, where this is going is brilliant, but it's not for me. And if you've got your shareholder agreements and things like that sorted out, you know how to deal with that, and there are provisions in place. Building on that, other kind of pitfalls will be things like shareholder loan agreements. People might put their money in early days. You might borrow from family and friends, great, until it's not great and you haven't worked out who's paying who, when and what. So these are the sorts of things we see as the kind of the fallings out as business advisors that you sort of think, well, we wouldn't have expected that. An anecdotal, not in the games industry, but there was a really good example of some people who put 2-year notice clauses in the directors' contracts so that they couldn't leave without 2 years' notice.
Right.
They had a brilliant offer come in, and it was a colleague of mine had a meeting with one of the brothers, and he said, I need to work out what we're going to do. because we've got these notice clauses. And he said, but that was the point. You put them in to protect yourselves. And he said, no, I want rid of my brother. Oh. And the point was they thought they'd done the right thing, but they hadn't really thought it through, so they just put a big number in. But actually they didn't think about, well, what if we do want to go in a separate direction? So Phil talked about planning for success. I would plan for, not failure, but parting of the ways. Plan for the fact that that might happen, because it just might. And that doesn't have to be a problem.
Is that something that every studio needs, do you think?
That would be a bold statement, because perhaps not. You know, if you're setting up on your own initially, you maybe don't need to worry about a number of those things. But even when you're setting up on your own, you're likely to have some other people involved. And I think being really clear about how that's going to look for them, what their employment contracts might look for, or if it's not an employment contract, how they're going to be engaged, if there are going to be share options, if they might have equity in the business. I think, yes, all of those things early, it is really important. And it's not fun and exciting like building a game, but it will save a lot of heartache in the future. And also, even if there is success or failure, whatever way it goes, those things are important.
They still hang around in the pitfalls then, Neil. What have you seen? What surprised you? What are the repetitious things that studios, the mistakes they fall into?
The biggest one was, I'm just going to say, the fact that she show a whole shareholding agreement. This is the key thing. When the studio starts up, it's friends, it's mates, the studio's growing, and all of a sudden things can change. You know, studio over a 5 to 10 year growth will be successful over a period of time, and all of a sudden the shareholding agreement is the whole thing. It's just like, well, hang on a minute, you're earning more than me. But that wasn't the conversation I had about 10 years ago. These things you have to get in place from day one, because it's a business now. It's not just, you know, it's a great place to be, no doubt. You know, to have friends, part of your business, and you grow, it's super exciting, and go for it, absolutely. But some of these basic things you've got to have in place. It will otherwise really change the whole environment.
And Phil, have you got anything to add to this pitfalls debate? Are there anything insurance-wise that people perhaps don't do that they perhaps should do?
Yeah, so rather than sort of pitfalls, I think there's a lot of risks that we see with insurance. So rather than, you know, and these guys have kind of covered already, you know, a lot of common things, but something specific that I see quite often is where studios assume that they can use stuff that they've been provided. That's kind of a vague thing that I'm saying, but let me explain. So if you've hired somebody to do the artwork for your game, and they presented it with you and you put it in, and you just assume that they've got that, or they've got the rights to use that, and because you've paid for it, you can put it in and put it in the released product. You need to check your contracts and make sure that you're actually allowed to do that, and they're not going to come knocking 2 years later after the game ships and say, oh, hey, you now owe me 10% of your revenue because I never approved for that to go. And I gave you the artwork, but didn't approve for it to go in the game. That's something that we see happen quite often. And the asset store as well, you've got to be really careful of getting assets off that, because if you read the Unity and Unreal terms, they waive responsibility of it. So don't just assume because you bought an asset from an asset store you can use it. You need to be careful with those. So that's another common thing that we see. So a bit of a pitfall there is, I guess, just assuming that you can use everything without double checking and doing your homework, because it could come back to bite you. And it does happen where, you know, people come out of the woodwork later on a project and say, oh, you know, you now owe me this because you didn't have a contract where you signed a proper release for it. So that's a very, very specific tip, but I didn't want to just sit here and say, oh yeah, my advice is go and get advice. There's
a surprising number of things in the world that when you buy them, you still don't own them. I'm always surprised by that. Video games, you buy a video game, you don't own that. You have the right to play that game, but you don't own it. You can't monetize it.
Yeah.
My BT broadband, apparently, I'm not paying to get that service. I'm paying in the hope that I get the service. That's what they said to me. Let's bring some personal stories into this.
Just wanted to add also that one of the pitfalls we've seen in new studios is plan your infrastructure. Super important. So if you're working on a project and this whole build overnight becomes bigger and bigger and bigger, and that's something that you've got to deliver with your clients, etc., make sure you plan your infrastructure. It's so important.
What does that mean? Sorry, I don't know what that means.
So often we find with development studios, they will have a build overnight, ready for the devs next day. Now, we've seen so many times where you get a studio working for a publisher and this build is getting bigger and bigger, But the problem you've got is that the infrastructure, the hardware that you've got to compile this build is quite old. And all of a sudden, this day is looming now that you've got to deliver something. So plan the infrastructure. We've seen too much panicking going on with, we need to really get this infrastructure sorted now. Can we have it next week? No. And that's the problem. So plan the infrastructure. That's the key thing.
That's quite a difficult thing to do, though, isn't it? To really know what you're going to need in the future. Are there ways of, I suppose it's talking to experts and learning from other people's mistakes? I guess that's the way to do
Absolutely.
it, isn't it?
We can do a lot of data analysis internally. We can start. We will pretty much know what needs to be delivered from the project sizes that you're working with. Today, we see in film and TV and VFX, projects are just getting bigger and bigger. Infrastructure now has to be really finely tuned. Yes, there's expenditure there, so the last thing you want also is a big bill arriving and there's no funds for it. So planning is absolutely key.
Apologies to anyone from BT in the room, by the way. I don't want to fall out with them further. So in a second, I'm going to come to the audience and see if there's any questions that you have for our business support experts here. But I've got a few more questions, so you've got a little bit of thinking time. So let's try and get on the positives again, shall we? Sorry, I dragged us down on that last one, following Neil's lead. But we've talked about sort of pitfalls and some of the common mistakes. You can learn a lot from that, but if you get it right, you can reap the rewards. There are benefits from being organised and planning. So are there sort of commercial imperatives? Are there some positives we can tell the audience? And if you get things right, things go well for you. And have you got any practical examples of that kind of thing? Do you want to go first, Gareth? Because I've dropped you in the spot here. Go on, go for it.
You looked at me and I've got a microphone, so
no.
I can't really hide from that. Yeah, absolutely. So from my point of view, the big ones are, for example, get your budgeting in a good place. And it sounds really obvious, but very few people do it. And the reason that's what I would call a commercial imperative is so many things throw off that. It gives the management good information because then they can see where things are deviating. You probably find that most people will put together some form of budget to raise some form of financing early days. But if they're not keeping track of that and going back to it and revisiting it, it goes horribly wrong. And you do see that regularly. You see it in large studios as well, where they go wrong on budget. The other thing for me personally, being a person who works in tax, is work out early on whether you might qualify for some of the reliefs that are available. So like VGTR. Okay. Because that also then feeds back into that budgeting process. R&D tax reliefs, another brilliant
So what is VGTR for our audience then?
It is video games tax relief, and effectively, as we sit here today, if you have qualifying expenditure, you can expect to get about 20% back from Her Majesty, or His Majesty's, Freudian slip there, Revenue and Customs. So it's basically a government-sponsored incentive.
And qualifying expenditure includes salaries, business costs?
Absolutely. So it is all expenditure on what they call core expenditure, which is the development of a game. So it excludes things like the very, very early stage ideas, and it will exclude debugging and things like that. So it's that middle bit, hence the word core, of you really developing the game. So yes, it would be salaries, it would be licensing costs, all of those sorts of things.
Right, so 20% claim back from the government. Talk to Gareth about it, help you get some money. That's lovely. Neil, you picked up the microphone, or were handed the microphone, as if Phil didn't want to answer this one. So
give it me back.
Let's ask Phil. No, let's go to you. So you get things lined up, things are going well. What's the sort of the dream here? What are we looking at in terms of opportunities?
This is, studios growing, infrastructure's in place, all of a sudden now, more projects. You can deliver these other projects you're working on right now and moving forward. There are other projects you can take on board. Fantastic. The pressure you probably have there is, we need more people. But right now, having that infrastructure, etc., in place with all the right tools, that's going to really help grow your studio in a very, very positive way. Because often what we find with publishers, they actually want you to get cracking with the project. So.
I'm going to ask a question for the audience and then ask the audience if they have any questions, if that's all right. So earlier you were talking about budgeting. I mean, you budget in not just for a game project for a company, in life budgeting is useful. I've got a wonderful coloured spreadsheet. Hands up if you think you're good at budgeting. It's not bad, is it? It's not bad. There's hope for you then. Can you learn budgeting?
Yeah, I think you can. When you said there's hope for them with that numbers, I think there's hope for us because there were a lot of hands down there.
Oh, right. Opportunity, yeah.
But you absolutely can. And this is the point of going back to what we were talking about earlier, which is having your support network, find the people who can and teach you that and help you with it. And there are plenty of people who can. And once you've assimilated that skill, great, you can then do that. And then the day will come when you don't have to do it because you'll have a finance function to do it because everything's gone brilliantly. The other reason I think budgeting is so important and being really militant about the way you run the finance side of things and the document side of things is that will help you when you come to raise finance. It will help you take advantage of the offer. If someone comes knocking and says, we're quite interested in what you're doing, we'd like to fund you, we'd like to buy you, we'd like to, whatever it might be, partner with you. If they look through the door and see a complete mess, they go, okay, maybe this isn't the business for us, maybe we'll just go after the IP. Whereas if they look behind the door and see a professionally run outfit, they go, great, we can work with you. So your question was around how can that lead to better sort of commercial opportunities and things like that. That's how, because if you get those things done and you learn those skills along the way, people will take you more seriously and those opportunities, you'll be able to grasp them.
Yeah, lovely. Perfect, thank you. Any questions from the audience? Man in the hat, hello.
So, first thing I want to respond to something you said about budgeting. Budgeting is just one of the pieces. You need to be looking at modelling and forecasting as well, because you're not going to get your business plan together for that. And I'm going to say a few comments and then I'm going to come back with a question. Don't worry. So you went straight from we're starting a company to we're successful. There is a massive gap between those two things where your thesis will be wrong. You will have to pivot. You will have to work out what you're doing. Before you do that, you need to know what the appetite for risk is amongst your team. When we do our consulting and supporting teams, people's lack of understanding of their appetite for risk is a lot of the things that often means that their teams fall apart because they haven't understood how that shareholders agreement should be formed because they haven't taken into account what those people need to do. But my question,
Thank you, Oscar. Yeah.
is one of the key things that we find is people need to learn to pivot. Now, obviously, I can make lots of comments in it. I'm not going to. I'm going to ask you guys to do it. What strategies for pivoting would you recommend to people, or what have you seen that's been a really smart way to take them from the original thesis to the thing that then gets them to the point where they do get the work for hire, or they do get the investment, or they do get the option agreement?
So a company's made a plan, it's not going according to plan, they have to change their mind. How do they do that? What's the process and is it easy? Who wants to take that one? Because if not, Oscar's going to answer it. So...
Well, I think going back to what I said earlier is if you're trying to build a sustainable business and you've got good foundations, it's easier to pivot and change from working on your own IP to we've run out of money, we need to start doing work for hire. And that's something that we see fairly often in the industry. So yeah, having a sustainable business model is something that you need to plan for. It's something that not everybody can achieve. It's partly luck based, but yeah.
do you think companies are slow to pivot? Are they slow to realise that things are not going well?
That's a good
and
point.
They might not actually have another thought. There might not be a plan two. Yeah,
some of them are so like single-minded on we've got to make this work, and sometimes you do need to take a step back and kind of you can't see the wood for the trees. Like this isn't working. We need to do something. We need to do something a little bit different. But it's not an easy decision to make, and it's an industry of passionate people, and people believe in a project and they want to see it work. And sometimes they need to be told, "You got to try something different, guys."
The challenge with that as well is that there are millions of stories out there of the successful entrepreneur who stuck to their guns, and therefore it's so easy to go, "No, I'm right about this because I've seen all these examples of the people who were right, so I will stick to it." So I come back, because I'm a bit dull, I guess, to this idea of your trusted support network. Because you might have someone like Oscar who says, look, I can tell you 20 stories of this having gone wrong in the last 5 years. So yeah, you might be right that Richard Branson gutsed it out and made a success of something, but I can tell you of these guys who, in your particular industry, didn't. So you might want to think about alternative revenue streams. You might want to think about looking elsewhere.
Yeah, it doesn't need to be a negative thing either. It doesn't mean something's failing and we need to pivot. It might be, oh, there's a new opportunity that we want to explore that's going to be better for everybody. But yeah, you're right. You only hear the success stories, but there's, I hate to say it, there's a lot of companies out there that have closed down over the last year that you don't really, you hear about the big ones, but there's a lot of smaller ones. Unfortunately, we had quite a few on our books that we've unfortunately, they've shut down this year, which is sad, and you never hear about them. But so don't just focus on the positives and say, oh, I want to be like that. You've got to look at the bigger picture. So, yeah.
Excellent. And, do you want to add something to this? Or no? Okay. Thank you for the question, Oscar. Really appreciate it. Any more questions from the audience? Okay, we've got a couple of hands. We'll start here, then I'll come to you next, if that's okay. Yeah.
So my question is for insurance. Like, how a studio or a small game studio could potentially leverage that, or in the future as it grows, what it's the kind of thing that should be insured or can be insured, and that's important.
Is your question what can be insured in terms of your own assets and materials, your own IP? Is that what you mean?
I guess the question is more like how it works, really, because for me it's kind of like two different words.
Cool. Okay, so that's a pretty big question to unpack, but I'm going to be at the stand afterwards if you want to have a more like what is insurance. But there's lots of different things that can be insured, but a very short answer is you can insure risks and unforeseen things, but you can't insure against bad business decisions. And what I mean by that is, because I get asked quite a lot, like, oh, what if my project fails? Can I get insurance for that? And that's just unfortunate. But you can get insurance for being sued or copyright infringement, or you've breached a contract if you're doing work for hire and you haven't delivered properly. So there's insurance for things like that, but you can't get insurance for just, we've made bad business decisions or the market hasn't favored us. You can't get insurance against a project not working out or the business has closed down for whatever reason. But yeah, there's lots of things that can be covered. Professional indemnity is one thing. Directors and officers, you can get key person insurance. You can get insurance against what I'd call internal issues. So if you've got a tax dispute or an employment dispute, we've seen quite a lot of claims recently with employment tribunals, which sucks, but you can get insurance for that as a business. So lots of different things that can be covered. Too much to talk about here, but talk to us afterwards.
You can get insurance for events as well, can't you? Which I thought was interesting.
I've heard about that, yeah.
Just a little in joke. Sorry, I shouldn't do that. Yes, sir.
My question is also a plug hybrid, so I've got to apologise in advance. Apart from calling Gaming Recruiter, who you can find on LinkedIn, some top tips for people that may be starting out or growing their studios in this room when it comes to finding the right people that fit your cultural values.
Yeah, the challenge of finding people that fit your culture and your values as a company. I mean, not every company actually has values and principles that they're prepared to print and publish. Maybe we should ask that. That's not funny. I'm being serious. Is it? Okay. What do you think about that? I mean, none of you... Are you recruiters? Who's recruited?
Not me. Not in that world.
I'm not really sure if that's a question, but something that we've seen is for studios trying to identify what their culture is, whether it's an in-person or a remote studio, is something that comes up quite a lot. And I've seen it work well where a studio decides we're going to go one way or the other, and we've seen struggles where it's kind of half and half, and some people want one thing and others want another. So that comes up quite often.
I suppose the short answer is the people are the most important people in any company. So you do have to do that properly and appropriately. We don't have recruitment experts here, unfortunately, to talk about that. But the need to get it right is imperative, particularly when you see a younger audience are more testing and challenging on the culture of companies, which is the right thing to do. They're more prepared to challenge companies these days and look at the culture. And fortunately, some of the stories are coming out, not just in games, but across all industries, about companies that mismanage that. And I think that's good because it starts to make people realise how important that is and up their game. So I think that's a really important thing. So thank you for asking that question, even though we haven't answered it, and I'm really sorry. Maybe you should be on the panel. Yeah, there might be a queue of recruiters tax. Trying to... You ask him about tax?
I'll ask him about tax.
Oh, is this, are we trying to get back at our audience? We're meant to be friendly with the audience. He might know about tax as well. Do you know anything about tax? Next year. Okay, you see? Yeah, wonderful. Right, before this all breaks down, are there any more questions we have? Yes, indeed.
So I think we touched on data handling, but we may be expanding to other markets, so not just here in the UK, but in the US and maybe even in Asia. What considerations do we consider for tax, not just tax purposes, but also for data governance and things like that?
So being successful in one market is fine, but going global, there are challenges there, both in terms of running the business, the data that you manage, and taxation principles. Over to you.
Yeah, so I definitely won't talk about the data, but in terms of the business, you make a good point, because once you are operating in multiple territories, you have to think about what does that mean in each of those territories. So the way you engage people in different territories, you might want to have different entities. That will bring with it regulatory requirements, tax being part of that. You may have a tax presence overseas, whether or not you have a company there. Having people there can create a permanent establishment. That brings with it things you have to do. So when you're looking at going cross-border, and the point is, not just the games industry, but in particular it is happening there, people are working cross-border much more. They're accessing talent in all over the world. And if it is the case that you don't plan for that and you don't think about it up front, which clearly you're asking the questions, so that's a great start, you can trip over all sorts of things, and that can become very expensive. So the best thing you can do is plan for where you're going to be going, what you're going to be doing, and find out about it. There's loads of good online guides, but again, broken record that I am, comes back to, if you've got those good advisors that you can speak to, it doesn't have to be a massively expensive project, but they can point you in the right direction. And there are lots of territories that have quite good publications on their finance authority websites, their company's house equivalent, that will tell you the kind of things you need to worry about. There are lots of things that various people do around, well, if you are looking to go overseas, this is what you need to look at. I previously did some work with one of the government institutes that helps on those sorts of things. So there's all sorts of stuff out there, but thinking about it, going out and finding and being curious is the right answer from my point of view, because otherwise you can trip over things that become expensive.
Yeah, there are certainly some specialist companies out there that help with setting up offices overseas. We're still covered by a lot of the European regulations for data, actually, even though we're apparently no longer in Europe. It doesn't feel like it sometimes. The data regulatory framework is still there for the UK. So there are some specialists. I can help you with that afterwards if that would be of any interest. Okay. Marvellous. So now, let's look at some of the, this is talk about business basics, but I want to be a little bit more expansive in the last few minutes if we can, looking at where the games industry is going and what the opportunities are. So we're taking the trust here that people have navigated something. They've pivoted at least twice. They're moving around and they're evolving and they've got their business set in place. There are things going on in the games industry all the time. It's a moving target. What are the things that you're seeing that are having a big impact on the games industry that will affect the way businesses are run in the future?
I'll definitely say the community is growing constantly across the UK. We look at studios down south, in the Midlands and the north, and I can include Scotland in that as well. But the communities are constantly growing, and I've never seen these.
Do you mean the communities as in the people that play their games,
or actually
their own
developer communities?
Oh, okay, right. Okay.
Absolutely, this is just growing constantly. Yes, we saw what I call the 9-year cycle of death last year, but this year and 2025 is going to be phenomenal for growth. This year we're just calming down with what's happened last year. We embrace that, but we're going to take that as a positive and we're going to actually grow with this. But the most important thing I've seen is this whole developer community just constantly growing. And it comes back to what we were saying earlier on about, your connections. If you do have any, core questions from a business point of view, and you can actually just reach out to some of these other well-established businesses. You can strike a conversation, but the communities are growing. And
is that happening because people understand the need of collaboration and the value they bring to that relationship? I mean, why is that happening? Absolutely.
And from my point of view, I feel there's a lot of pressure on a lot of studios right now to deliver. They've now got these huge milestones they've got to hit. And often, a lot of younger studios want to really expand really rapidly. How can we do that? I want to be this multi-AAA studio within 5 years. Well, yes, you can be, and that's fantastic, and I'm sure you will be. But my fear factor there will be is their growth, and also obviously the cash flow and so forth. I want to see studios, especially on this initial growth plan, to communicate and strike conversations with other studios. And collaboration as well, we see in certain sectors within the UK, certain regions, they've got their own little meetups going on, etc., and they're talking about projects and so forth. We're seeing projects being flipped from one studio to another. I've seen that happen before. Works, they've delivered it, but it's great. They're all working as a team.
What about you, Phil? What are you seeing in the industry at the moment that's affecting and shaping businesses and the way they develop?
Yeah, I guess the elephant in the room is all the layoffs that we've had over the last year. It's been really terrible. We've seen studios closing, and it feels like the appetite for games is cooling off. But I don't think that's the case. I think it's sort of rebalancing. There was a huge boom of investment in the industry a couple of years ago, and that's cooled off now. But it doesn't mean that the games industry as a whole is shrinking. It's not. It's still growing, and I'm excited about what's coming for the next 2 years. As Neil said, I think we're going to see growth, continued growth. I think there's going to be more studios popping up, and we're going to see more investment, more excitement in the industry. There's still lots of indie hits out there, like Pal World came out of nowhere, and that's been this huge success story. So I think stories like that are great because it shows that the investment in the industry can work. And that studio, if you read the story that the guy wrote that headed up the studio, he was saying he was pitching, he couldn't get investment, so they just did it themselves. And I bet everybody that he pitched to is now kicking themselves. So I think that we're going to see a lot more interest, and I think it's really going to pick up again over the next 2 years.
And perhaps a regeneration. If people are moving on from one company, there's a chance to potentially set up their own business. That often happens in the games industry. So that's an excitement. So thank you for that. And Gareth, from you?
I think a lot of the themes are the same. The point about the communities and the hubs of people is a great one. The kind of the rebalancing. I sort of look at the games industry as being similar. During COVID, like a lot of us, it sort of almost felt like it sat around a bit and had too much sugar and got a bit hot and excited, and then it's just now cooling down and having a bit of a sugar crash, which means we'll come back to equilibrium, and that is the signs we're starting to see. And I think the point is there's always people on the lookout for talent in the industry. So whilst all of these people who have been unfortunate enough to be affected by the layoffs, and that is, undoubtedly at this moment in time very unpleasant for a number of people, in the fullness of time, because there is that need, and they may set up on their own, I think they'll probably look back and actually say, well, yes, at that moment it was bad, but across the course of my career it wasn't that big a deal, because the industry is still fundamentally buoyant and is still growing, as you say. So there's some pain points, but I do see that as being a real positive. And the other thing that we haven't really talked about is, but the lady did mention about the overseas things, and I think that builds on the community piece and the pockets of talent. And I could get into a discussion about UK policy around this, but I won't. But what we're seeing is lots of people using the overseas talent to do the things that the UK maybe aren't good at, and then really focusing in on what the UK is good at. And I quite personally like that, because I think competitive advantage is all about doing the things you do well to the best of your ability, not trying to pick up the other things. And so the fact that the world is shrinking, I think, is a really good thing and a really good opportunity.
So we talked about trends. Final question then. A nice short answer, if you don't mind. What are you looking forward to, Gareth, in the games industry in the next couple? It could be anything. It could be a game. It could be a development. What's exciting you about the games industry as we look forward?
Well, given that we're short on time, the most exciting thing for me is Rugby 24, because they have yet to make a rugby game since Jonah Lomi Rugby in 1997.
Okay, all right. Shout out to Codemasters for that one. Phil?
I'm excited about more cross-media opportunities, so movie tie-ins that are focusing on games. I think the traditional movie industry and media are really paying attention to games now. So
yeah, games rules, doesn't it? Yeah,
coming out next on Netflix. Yeah.
Lovely, thank you. And Neil, final word to you.
Super excited by new studios popping up this year. New names, new faces, etc. And it's a wealth of talent we've got here today. So it's going to be a fantastic year, it really is.
Thank you very much to our panel, and thank you for joining us. Put your hands together for Gareth, Phil, and Neil.